Because Ezra understood, and the rabbis after Ezra understood, that the tradition has many meanings. Because the tradition, I want to give you 3 words for it, the tradition is thick. That means you cannot exhaust it in one study, because it's like a good work of art, and every time you go back to it, you will be given something else. That the tradition is complex. It speaks with many voices, and the tradition is conflicted. That means there's all kinds of tensions and contradictions in the tradition, all of which have to be sorted out again, so that Ezra and the rabbis and the covenant mediators are always sorting it out, so that when a Presbyterian preacher gets up to preach, what she does is to say, I don't have any great universal truths for you this morning, but let me tell you what this seems like to me today for us in our journey of faithful living in the world. And the preacher knows, and the assembly knows, that because the tradition is thick and complex and conflicted, that the teacher will come back next week with a different read from another angle, and so that what interpretation intends to do is to keep us open to the Spirit, who is the real reader of the text, who has many things to teach us yet. So you can see in the book of Exodus, in the book of Deuteronomy, and with Ezra, you can see that interpretation is an open, contested, disputation, ongoing piece of work that protests against fundamentalism, as though text had one meaning, and that protests against historical criticism, as though you can figure out what the original author might have intended. And the final text that I will mention in this sequence is that in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, Jesus says many times, "You have heard it said of old," the Victor Borge, "but I say to you." So Jesus is functioning like Moses, like the covenant mediator, like the interpreter, who is taking the old tradition and turning it so that it can be heard afresh by his disciples, whom he calls to radical obedience. It's no wonder that they called him rabbi, because he is a translator and interpreter of the text, and Jesus calls his disciples to live with a tradition that is thick and complex and conflicted, with enough to be faithful today. Now, I want to unpack that a bit more by saying that the tradition that is always interpreted again is vigorously pluralistic. Conservatives like to say, and those kind of conservatives, you know, they have a Bible with a limber leather so you can fold it back like this. The Bible says, as though the Bible said one thing. Liberals say the biblical view is, same thing. So I want to talk about pluralism. Let me add a footnote. What the rabbis taught Sigmund Freud I won't develop this, but it's for you to think about, is that we are just like the text. We are thick, complex, and conflicted people. So the whole Freudian insight into what became psychoanalysis is like rabbinic script analysis, psychoanalysis, in which you factor out the thickness, the complexity, and the conflictedness of the self. So it helps to recognize that we ourselves are pluralistic, which gives us access to the pluralism of the Bible. And the reason this is so important to recognize is that our culture wants us not to be thick, not to be complex, and not to be conflicted. It wants to be about one thing and to act one way. But pastors help people process this all the time. Pastors have people come and say, I know that homosexuality is a sin. But I just found out that my niece is a lesbian and I love her very much and I don't know what to do. And the pastor says, aha, I can see that you are thick, complex, and conflicted. And I will help you live through that. That's what the church does. For the most part, the church is the only place in town that helps people process that stuff. And what invariably happens with a church like Village Church and these kinds of traditions is that people grow up in these authoritarian religious communities that believe there's one way, but eventually they find their way to this kind of a church because what I've discovered is I can't live that way anymore because I am too complex to pretend. So I'm going to talk about the Bible, but I'm really talking about us. You may know that historical criticism in the 19th century arrived at the hypothesis, and if you don't know, it doesn't matter, arrived at the hypothesis of J, E, D, and P. That's called the documentary hypothesis, which argued that there are traceable literary strands in the Pentateuch. Now, that was simply a clumsy way in the 19th century of saying that the biblical text is thick, complex, and conflicted. So let me tell you what's happened to that hypothesis. Most scholars do not follow that hypothesis anymore, but we keep teaching it because you've got to fill up the semester. But what's come from that hypothesis is that most scholars would now say that what you got are not J, E, D, and P. What you got are P and D. P stands for priestly. And those are the texts that talk about how to maintain liturgical propriety so that if you're an Episcopalian, you have to learn which way to turn and which way to make the cross. And every church has punctilious rules, even churches that call themselves free churches. If a new pastor violates it, everybody notices, because that's not the way we do it in our church. That's priestly. And we got D, which refers to Deuteronomy. Now, I want to talk about those two traditions. The priestly tradition is committed to the practice. I got to look at my clock here. I got my watch turned upside down. I got it. the priestly tradition is committed to the practice of holiness. In Leviticus 19:2, which is at the center of the priestly tradition, it says, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And then it lays out how to be holy in your sex life with women that menstruate. It's all very patriarchal. How to be holy if you got people with leprosy or some other dangerous epidemic in your community. How to be holy about food. How to be holy about offerings. How to maintain an ordered, disciplined life in the presence of God. And you probably know that in the book of Leviticus are the clearest rejections of homosexual relationships, how to be holy in the practice of sexuality. The extreme case in Leviticus 19:19 says, "You shall not plant wheat and rye in the same field, and you shall not wear a shirt that's got wool and cotton." Don't mix things up. No synthetics. The D tradition, Deuteronomy, is committed to social justice. It's the great liberation document of the Old Testament. So there you will find commandments saying, you gotta have a welfare program for widows and orphans and immigrants. In a patriarchal society, widows, orphans, and immigrants are the most vulnerable and exposed and helpless people. So if they don't have a male advocate in the family, the community has to rally around and take care of them. One German scholar has written that the book of Deuteronomy is the first proposal in human history of a social safety net for people who have no resources. Now, have I laid that out clearly enough for you to see that the priestly tradition segues to what we call conservatism? And the D tradition is transposed into what we might call liberal or progressive theology, so that the P tradition and the D tradition are in acute tension in the Old Testament. But I want to observe two things about this tradition. The first thing I want to observe is that each of these traditions, I've described to you the main tendency, they both include in them texts that you would expect to find in the other tradition. On the one hand, the priestly tradition in the book of Leviticus has the only teaching in the Old Testament about the Jubilee year, and the Jubilee year is the most dangerous economic teaching in the whole of the Bible. Because the Jubilee year says you got to give stuff back to people. That should have been in the book of Deuteronomy, but they put it in. On the other hand, the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 14 has got 20 verses of things you mustn't eat because they are not holy. All kinds of shellfish and I don't know what all. Also got a little note in there about you got to get your hair cut a certain way so that you can be God's holy people. Because if you cut your hair wrong, you're going to mess that up.